Hello! It's really lovely to be here. It's an amazing venue, isn't it? This place and the views out the windows and everything. It's so cool. So thanks to Zoe and all these wonderful team of people organising these conferences. We are now officially on a road trip, me and Sheena and Mark and Zoe and everybody. It's like some kind of rock and roll experience. No, it isn't. But yeah, it's really, really exciting. And yeah, amazing to be here, so thank you. And what an amazing thing that Zoe and the team are pulling off and bringing together. So many different voices have spoken at these different events, and I have felt really privileged to hear them. And so today I'm going to title of my talk is Information is Power. And so I guess I'm going to talk about information and the information we give to pregnant women and power in birth, and how getting more information when you are pregnant can only be a good thing, although, surprisingly, it sometimes seems to be slightly discouraged. And I was really, really heartened to hear Zoe's talk this morning, and I loved the bit she said about putting your fists behind your bum, because that is the kind of thing that I'm so passionate about. It's not about telling everybody to do birth in a certain way, which is sometimes what people think antenatal teachers or people like me are interested in sort of having an agenda. That sort of information that Zoe's talking about is what I'm interested in, because it's talking about empathy. It's saying, hang on a minute, what is this like for that person who is in that situation? And unfortunately, in maternity care, that question doesn't always get asked. Sometimes the people who ask it get held up as really big pioneers, for just saying, what's it like to be in their shoes? For doing the lithotomy challenge and lying, some obstetricians have done this with their feet in stirrups. And people are like, oh, these obstetricians are almost like gods because they've actually stopped and put their feet in stirrups and thought about it. Now, I'm not criticising them. It's brilliant that they've done it. But at the same time, it's quite shocking too that it's such a pioneering thing to do, to actually stop for a moment and think, what is it like for this person who's in this situation, and how can we make it better? How can we make it better is the question that keeps me going. And that was a perfect example of it, so thank you. So I just wanted to tell you about, to introduce myself, I forgot to tell you who I am, but I think that you probably know that I run an organisation called the Positive Birth Movement, which I'm going to talk a bit about, and that I have got a book called The Positive Birth Book, which some of you have read. So my book, I guess, The Positive Birth Book, is all about information, getting information to pregnant women and empowering them through information and telling them, don't be afraid, don't let fear stop you from asking questions and finding out things. And I have got a book coming out in August, which I'm really excited about, so I just wanted to tell you about, which is called Give Birth Like a Feminist. And I've got some free bookmarks with me today, so come and find me if you'd like a bookmark. I'm really excited about them. They only arrived in a big box the other day, so I'm taking them with me everywhere. So yeah, I definitely believe that birth is a feminist issue, obviously, which is why I've written this book, and that's what this book is about. And I definitely believe that, we've got lots of things that need to be said about women's power, women's agency in the birth room, women as the key decision makers in the birth room, and that we also need to ask some feminist questions about information and why there are issues around women finding out information about birth and asking questions and wanting to become informed. These are my children. I always put this slide in because it just makes me feel nice to see them when I'm standing on a stage feeling a bit vulnerable. But this is my life in Somerset, really. I'm very lucky to live where I live. And these are my mad kids. This is Bess, the eldest, who was born in hospital. I was induced for being overdue, and had ended up with a forceps delivery. And the other two were born at home in water, in very hands-off experiences. And I'm really interested in that kind of experience as well, because I'm one of those rare women who's had 2 out of my 3 babies with nobody touching me. I didn't have any vaginal exams. I didn't have any intervention at all. And when I say didn't have any intervention, I mean I literally didn't have any other human in my space. I was just in my water, and I gave birth to my babies. And obviously my midwives were amazing, and they caught my babies because I didn't want to do that. I couldn't. I was like, what do you mean catch my own baby? I'm busy. But I know some women even managed to do that. So literally that kind of hands-off birth that I was so lucky to have is so rare and so hard to access now. And I'm very interested in that question as well, in asking, does that matter? Because it is approaching extinction. That kind of birth is approaching extinction. And as a frame of reference for women, it's disappearing as well. So if you're asking women, are you having a good or a positive birth experience? They are not comparing it to births like that, because it's disappearing from research, it's disappearing from our narrative as humans. Does that matter? So just to tell you a bit about the positive birth movement, it is basically, in case you haven't come across us, but I know some of you have, it's basically a network of free antenatal groups. So instead of going to a class, it's just a peer-to-peer discussion group. So there are each month we have a monthly theme, but the group is free to move on from that theme if they're not interested in that particular topic. It's just women supporting women, talking to other women, listening to other birth stories and sharing information, and dads as well, and partners obviously are welcome too. So we've got about 250 groups in the UK, and there's about another 100 or more all around the rest of the world. In fact, I think that slide might be out of date. I think it's more like 200 plus in the rest of the world. And they are definitely a place where just through listening to other women and other people who've had babies or who are planning their births, you can get information just from that, and just by hearing other people's choices, hearing of other people who've been in similar situations to you. And the whole thing is kind of uber linked up by social media. So that was where I the original idea started, was rather than just having all these little groups, which happen anyway, really, there are lots of birth support groups and birth discussion groups, but can we use social media to connect them up and kind of supercharge them, so that the woman in Leeds who is, 41 weeks pregnant and the doctors are saying this and she's not sure and she needs to find more evidence, doesn't just have to talk to the women or the people that are in that group. She can then, go on social media or use the network system to find information much wider. And it's fascinating, actually, because the more you learn about birth practices in different geographical areas, the more you realise how potluck what happens to people in birth is. So just a few pictures of our groups, just to show you, because it gives you a bit of a flavour of what the positive birth movement's all about. Here's our group in Amsterdam, Cape Town, Mumbai, Hull, Hua Hin in Thailand. Hope they invite me someday. Nice holiday, isn't it? This is a recent picture of a really busy group in Aylesbury, and that was actually after some people left, apparently. So some of the groups are really well supported and they're packed, and other groups can sometimes be empty. I sometimes get people contact me saying, I've been running my group for a year or 2 years and I can't get anyone to come. So please, 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 if you want, you're most welcome to go to a positive birth movement group. You don't have to be pregnant. You are totally, totally welcome. The only thing that we don't allow is people sort of selling something. So we don't let people come along and, talk about their hypnobirthing lessons or whatever. It's just, you have to be there as a human, basically, not as a doula or a hypnobirthing teacher. But you're absolutely welcome to go. And of course, it is okay to say what you do for a living, but you just can't push it down people's throats, if you know what I mean. So here's another busy group in Woking. And in Australia, we've got about 20 or 30 groups. And Chile. And this is a group that happened in Tunbridge Wells, which was the only ever dads only group, but I always put that photo in because it's quite sweet, isn't it? And they all had wine, apparently. It's quite a heartwarming picture. So yes, and we do have this big online presence, like I was explaining, which helps us to kind of connect people together. I quite often get people messaging me saying, this is happening to me, I don't know what to do, I like to find out more about the evidence about this or whatever. So I can then post that usually on our Facebook page, and we use social media to do that, to connect people together. We've got several Facebook groups as well, like a student midwives one, for example, which you're welcome to come and find via our website and join. If you just click on the bit that says link up, you'll find a whole list of them. Also I love the way that you can use social media to share information, a different narrative about birth. So we've had various campaigns, like one called Birth Just Happened, and they usually just come about organically. But it usually snowballs with women sharing images of themselves, like in Birth Just Happened. They were sharing images of themselves just after they'd given birth, looking brilliant, full of life and elated. And so many pregnant people contacted me to say, this has really, really helped me to see these images and to see that you don't look like you've just been hit by a truck. You actually look really powerful and strong, and lots of the images were accompanied by people's words saying, I've never felt so amazing in my life. Birth was fantastic, and that is quite a shocking, narrative in the world that we live in. It's not what people are normally hearing. So social media can be brilliant like that for sort of getting people talking and showing images of positive birth. So this is the definition that I wrote about 6 or 7 years ago when I started the positive birth movement, and it has remained the same ever since, although I'm happy for it to be challenged. Apart from point 3, which I put in about 2 years ago, women are listened to and treated with respect and dignity. I think naively I thought that went without saying, but the more immersed in the birth world and in women's experiences of birth I became, the more I started to realise that it didn't go without saying, and that it needed to be overtly stated. And in particular, I think that point about being listened to is absolutely at the essence of every birth story that you hear, positive or not positive. That is what makes birth positive for people largely, and I'm not meaning to make sweeping generalisations, but it really is the key. If people it doesn't matter where they give birth, how they give birth, whether they get the birth they planned or wanted, or whether they get a very, very different experience that they weren't expecting. If they feel that they were properly listened to throughout by the people who were looking after them and attending them, then they normally will feel positively about it afterwards. And ditto the opposite. People who have had traumatic experiences, who felt that loss of control, it's normally because they felt quite often that they were almost disembodied and not being heard at all in that experience. So yes, that's the definition. And then this idea, which I always put at the bottom of this slide, of a healthy baby not being all that matters, has sort of followed me around and underpinned a lot of everything that I've been doing and writing about as a writer and a freelance journalist and talking about for the past 6 or 7 years. That phrase trips off our tongues in our culture a lot. A healthy baby is not all that matters, and or a healthy baby is all that matters, sorry. That's the one that trips off my tongue, is that it's not all that matters. and it's very well-meaning. It's meant to reassure people, quite often, people who've had a traumatic or a difficult birth and who are trying to talk about it afterwards and trying to come to terms with it and make sense of it. But often it does the opposite. It actually makes them feel very silenced. And when I wrote an article that said that it was that phrase was silencing women, that is the most viral article that I've ever written. It got shared hundreds of thousands of times. So I think I can conclude from that it spoke to people, and it said something that needed to be said, which is that when a person's had a traumatic birth, they don't want to be reassured in that way. They want people to actually listen to their experience, and they don't want to be told that they need to focus on the baby, because they matter too. So this is my crap infographic on where I try to sort of retrospectively analyse why and how the heck did I manage to do this? And I sometimes do wonder why I did start the positive birth movement, because it has become a kind of it's snowballed into this huge thing, which is a wonderful thing, but I am still the only person really who's running the organisation, although obviously there's lots of people running the groups. So people write letters to me saying, "Dear Milli team," and I'm like, where's the team gone? There isn't a team, it's just me. So it was a bit of a daft thing that I did, but anyway, I'm very proud of it at the same time. So my reason for starting it, as I said, kind of came into birth and parenting as someone who'd been interested in feminism, quite opinionated person, quite interested in, equality or women's rights and human rights, and was quite alarmed when I was pregnant for the first time at how I suddenly felt a little bit infantilized in quite a lot of the interactions that I went into. And I hadn't had that experience before, really. I was a woman, I had a career, I was, had different relationships, and I had never experienced that sort of patronizing approach that intensely as I did when I was pregnant. And this language that came up all the time in other people's birth stories and in my own birth experience of I wasn't allowed to do this, or I was allowed to do this, or they let me do this, or they didn't let me do this. And I was quite shocked to hear people talking about their birth experiences in that way, in a world where I had sort of thought that feminism had kind of addressed that sort of massive imbalance, where women having to ask permission to behave in certain ways or do certain things. So I was quite shocked by that. And obviously my personal experiences of birth as well. I'd had one baby in a quite traumatic hospital birth, and I'd had one home birth. So I'd kind of done some work for myself around, thinking a lot about birth, reading a lot about birth, and processing those experiences that I had myself. And I came into the whole thing with a background as a psychotherapist, and largely a group psychotherapist. So I was very interested, and I only sort of realised this, again, sort of thinking about it in retrospect, but I was very interested in the power of the group as an entity of itself, as a powerful thing of itself, because that is how group therapy works. Quite often in a group therapy session, the therapist doesn't do, they don't do anything, they don't say anything, and the group does the work, but the therapist just holds the space. And so, and that can be very transformative for the people in the group. Just listening to other people, hearing other people's experiences in a place where they feel safe and held by the therapist, that is how group therapy works. So I was interested in that, but also in early attachment. I was thinking, wow, all these people having traumatic births, and then there was me in my sort of previous career, like dealing with people who had attachment disorders and addiction problems and things. It's like, why isn't anybody joining these dots? That there is a big problem around this first interaction that we're not really talking about. And also, I learnt as a therapist that when therapy is all about change, that's what therapy is all about. So I was thinking about birth and what needed to change in the birth world, and feeling that kind of frustration of like, well, it's impossible. How can you change the system? You feel like you're against many, many, many repeated brick walls. But then I was thinking about therapy, and in therapy what you learn is that you can't change other people. So if your life you've got struggles in your life, you need to look to yourself and look at changing the way you are and working on your own stuff. And then what then happens is that the other people in your life actually have to change because they come up against a different person, and the change might be very slight, but even the slightest of change in you can have a ripple effect that causes the people around you to have to change and to play different roles in their interactions with you. So I was thinking about that on a sort of grander scale in terms of birth, and thinking, well, how about we just start with the women, and we bring women together to talk about birth and to get more information about birth, and they go into the hospital or the labour ward or the birth centre ever so slightly different, maybe with a bit more of a sense of entitlement, maybe with a bit more information, maybe with a bit more sense of how birth might be a positive experience for them, that they might have some agency in. And maybe all of those things will actually force the system to change. So that's one of the things I've been trying to do, and I kind of think it's working. I do, just from hearing feedback from women who are having better experiences and who say, I'm so glad I knew about this because when it came down to the wire, I was able to ask that question and it helped me. Information is power. So the broken chain of wisdom is something that I've written about in my book, The Positive Birth book. And, you know, I'm just, in terms of information is power, it's, what I mean by it is the information about birth historically has been passed down from woman to woman along, you know, the mother line, if you like. And in the past sort of 50 years or so, so many people have been having traumatic birth experiences and disempowering birth experiences. And so what we've got now is several generations of women who have very big problems passing on wisdom to their daughters or their granddaughters because they maybe don't want to talk about what happened to them in their birth, or they maybe feel that that had to happen to them because that's just what birth is like. You have to leave your dignity at the door. You don't have a choice. You don't have a voice. So there's a lot of negativity and not very much wisdom, and that can make all the difference to you when you're pregnant. Somebody just saying to you, it's going to be great, you know, this is why, you know, taking you in that kind of like way of passing on those little nuggets of information and wisdom to you. And I think that chain is broken, and it's broken in breastfeeding as well. There's several generations of women who've been made to feel that they couldn't breastfeed because their bodies didn't work properly, exactly the same as birth. So then they find it very difficult to interact with the next generation who maybe want to try and do that because they've got so much pain about it. And when I go, this is me talking on stage at the baby show, which I do about 3 times a year. It's like, I feel like I'm in a confessional now telling you that because I don't want you to start throwing rotten tomatoes at me. Because I know lots of people really hate the baby show, and with quite good reason, really. There are lots of things not to like about it. And it is a pretty awful experience when you go. It's like, I don't know if any of you have been, but it's like big aircraft, hangar-type buildings and all these stands, and it's really funny, noisy and funny air quality and loads of people pushing buggies around frantically and getting free samples of bottles, and it's all like, ugh. But the people that run it are great. They're so nice, and they're so interested in all of the things that all of the people at this conference are going to be talking about. They are interested in those issues and in getting better information to women. And they love my book, and because it does that. And they let me stand on that stage and talk about human rights in birth, about declining things. You know, they let me get out there and say exactly what I like. And the first time I did it, I thought, they're never going to ask me back. But they did. So in some senses, it's a fantastic experience to be able to get right into the mainstream and talk about these issues and to get the message out there to people that they have a choice. But that's the thing that really shocks me, is that when you go right out there into the mainstream and you talk to real people who are really in the mainstream, not in your social media bubble or the place you live or all the folks you like to hang around with, you discover that many people do not realise that they have a choice. The lack of information, it's a desert. And when you get on a stage and talk to people about things like oxytocin, about, you know, being able to make choices about having human rights in their care, it's an absolute fucking shock to them to hear that message. It's such a shock. And isn't that appalling that we're living in a situation where just telling people that they have a choice is an absolute revelation? I think that's really shocking. So we need to challenge that, and we need to keep putting information out there and trying to help people access it, because it's only simple stuff. It's not like, you know, access to epic research and science and complicated stuff. It's the basics that people still are not accessing, and quite often, and this is where it comes back to the power, they're being disempowered and being told not to bother with all, you know, finding out all that stuff. Just go or turn up, go with the flow, you know, you can't control birth, etc. All of these messages are constant from the media and just from our culture. And no, you can't control birth, but you can influence it, can't you? Your choices can make a difference to what happens to you. And so there's this sort of void, you know, think about it as a sort of dark void of information, the broken chain of wisdom, people not really sharing birth stories or sharing frightening birth stories, and, you know, this kind of desert of information. And in that dark place, things grow up. Seeds grow in the dark, don't they? And I think the worst, most horrible triffid, sort of human-eating triffid that's grown out of that dark place is One Born Every Minute. I absolutely hate One Born Every Minute and all those similar programs. This is a thing I just screenshotted from, you know, the image selection of the program, but look at it, it says more than I could say in words, doesn't it? People hanging around holding babies. Whose babies are they? We don't know. Oh no, yes we do know. She's here. Her feet, anyway. So this whole sort of disempowering image of the medical professionals, didn't they do well? And, you know, the woman is sort of almost disembodied in the experience and disempowered, is so reinforced by this program. And the opportunity to use television, which is in everybody's living room, to empower people with information is being completely missed. So I'm thinking all these thoughts about One Born Every Minute all the time. I'm thinking maybe I'm being a bit unfair because, you know, a lot of people like it. But actually, when I was writing Give Birth Like a Feminist, I've written a chapter about culture. And so I started to read a lot more about all of this. And I discovered that there are some very clever researchers who are actually researching One Born Every Minute who agree with me. Or I agree with them, I should say. So I've just put a few of them up here just to tell you about them, because I think it's fascinating that they're researching One Born Every Minute and coming to the same conclusions. This isn't their research, this is just a tweet that I put on, but it's really interesting if you go on Twitter during the program and you watch what people are saying. You know, again, it's like dipping into the mainstream, being at the baby show. You get to listen in on how people are responding to the program. And there's so much fear. And lots of jokes, you know, people saying, oh, you know, this is the best contraception ever, you know, all that kind of thing. And this person saying, it's, you know, it helps them mentally prepare themselves for torture. I am terrified, even though I know what to expect. Exactly, that's exactly it, isn't it? They do know what to expect. That's what they're going to expect. They're going to expect it to be like the TV show. So this person here, these two people here in their paper in Studies in Maternal concluded that it portrays women as largely passive subjects, and that it encourages a very limited view of the possibilities for birth outside of dominant systems of control and surveillance that characterize obstetric practices in the global north. On top of this, it creates fear, which feeds into, I love this sentence, and reproduces ideas of birth as a crisis, which needs to be managed to a successful conclusion by medical experts. So it's reinforcing that narrative all the time in our living rooms. And there's another bunch called Televising Childbirth who you can find on Twitter. They've got a Twitter account. And they talk about how it shows overrepresents white heterosexual couples, and it also shows a medicalization of birth through the routinization of supposedly minor birth interventions. And the absence of the representation of women's choice over such interventions. And Julie, who works on this project, has spoken to me a lot and helped me with my book. And she says for her, this is the key point, that you don't see, whether it happens or not, we don't know, but on the program never takes the opportunity to show us a woman making a choice, a woman being told, these are your choices, this is the information based on your particular personal circumstance, and what choice would you like to make? You never see that. And finally, these guys, in this final paper from the University of York, they actually transcribed all of the conversations from One Born Every Minute and the interactions between women and partners and healthcare workers, and sort of did what they call a conversation analytic study, which sounds really cool, doesn't it? And basically, I love what they came up with. They came up with this term, assertions. And I love that term because it gives me a word for something that I'd kind of already noticed happening, but I didn't have a word for it. So assertions are what they term, midwives in particular, saying to people, we're just going to do this now, or we need to do this now, or we're just going, if you could just do this, we just need to do that. So the assertion basically says to the person, it's not presenting a choice, but it's also the way it uses we, I think, is interesting, because it kind of says there's more of us than there are of you. So it's kind of quite a clever choice of language to say, we the experts believe that you, the individual, should do this next. So with one born every minute, we've got a problem, haven't we? Because we've got this opportunity, this broadcasting opportunity, to get information and power to women and their partners that's being dramatically missed. But I think the other elephant in the room is that One Born Every Minute is not a TV show, it's reality. Okay, so everything that these researchers are concluding about what's going on the TV program is presumably true about what's happening in the majority of our maternity units and our maternity wards. The program goes to different ones every time, so it's not like it's one specific place that's not getting it right. This is maternity care that's being represented. And if it's being misrepresented, I don't see a queue of people queuing up to say, next time you make this program, can you represent it better? I don't hear those voices from maternity care. So just to quickly drop in that this is a good book to read if you're interested in knowledge and power and anthropology and birth. And I like this idea, which the whole book is based on. The book is called Childbirth and Authoritative Knowledge. It's a slow read. It's big and fat and dense and full of really, really clever people's ideas and thoughts. So it takes ages to read for someone like me, but it's fascinating. And it's, basically for any particular domain, several knowledge systems exist, some of which, by consensus, come to carry more weight than others. So in birth, the person with the authoritative knowledge is, so everyone has different knowledge, but the person with the authoritative knowledge is the person who gets to make the decisions. And in birth, the person with the authoritative knowledge is usually considered to be the healthcare professional. And we saw, actually, I was thinking when I was watching Zoe's presentation, this so beautifully illustrated by the story of the woman who had to get out of the pool. And if I've heard that story once, I've heard it 1,000 times, of a woman who has said, maybe not in a pool, maybe in a different situation, has said, I know what's happening in my body, and has been told, no, you don't. So when I talk about the positive birth movement, obviously generally people are really positive about it, but a couple of times I've just found it very interesting that people have said to me, I've sort of said, well, it's people get together, talk about birth, there's no like lessons or anything, it's just like exchange of ideas, social media, post on what you like, everybody comments, and you get to learn a bit more about your options. And a couple of times people said to me, really, is that safe? And first of all, it made me pause. I thought, shit, am I going to get sued because I've created something where people can have conversations about birth? It makes you think, doesn't it? But actually, it's a crazy question when you analyse it, because what it's saying is birth is women cannot be trusted not just to make the decisions about what happens to them in birth, or not just to say this is happening in my body now, but they can't even be trusted to just have a conversation about it. So do we trust that woman who's posting on social media to say, I'm 41 weeks, should I be induced, and listening to all the different views of the people that are being expressed? Do we trust her to make the right decision for herself and her baby based on the information she's getting? Sometimes not. So I just put these on because I thought they kind of go well with this idea, but these are different quotes from entirely different places, from experts who have said to women, what experts have said to women. So this one comes from Hermine Hayes-Klein, who ran the first Human Rights in Childbirth conference at The Hague, but she told me this, that a woman had this said to her, when she was trying to question about her choices, the obstetrician said, who is the captain of this ship? And this one, the next one, I am the expert here, comes from the story of Kimberly Turban, which you may or may not have come across. She was the woman in America who had an enforced episiotomy without consent, and brought a lawsuit about it. But it's very common to have an episiotomy without consent in America. And actually, I found women in this country as well who feel they didn't consent to an episiotomy. So it wasn't that extraordinary what happened to Kimberly, but what was extraordinary was that it was all caught on film. And what was even more extraordinary was that she felt empowered to do something about it afterwards, whereas many women would have just said, that's just what birth is like. But on that film, the guy says, she says, I don't want you to cut me, I want to try, I want more time. And he says to her, amongst other things, I am the expert here. And another one which I like, which came from a piece of research I was reading about women's experiences, the guy said, I have delivered hundreds of babies, you haven't delivered any. So you do see that attitude woven through maternity care. And I think it's really important that we kind of expose it and talk about it, because it's limiting, it's holding women back from knowledge. Another one that I had just recently that's actually gone in my book, about induction. This woman who had a BSc in biology from Durham University, and this happened recently in the last couple of years. And she was talking to her obstetrician about being induced, and she told him the research that she'd been doing, about the risks, the possible risks of induction, and she sort of listed them. And he said to her, oh, and where did you find that out? Net mums. So, and I hear stories like this all the time. So women are trying to get knowledge and get power, because the two go together in birth. Something is trying to prevent them. This is just a little quote from somebody who's been helped by the positive birth movement, but I'll just put it in because, she really talks about how she felt knowledge for her really was power, how much she'd learned from just listening to other women. And I just think that's so positive and wonderful, that just from listening to other people, and so quite often people are reading, who aren't commenting on threads, but they're reading these threads on social media where people are getting information about their birth choices, and from that they've got one key takeaway point: I have a choice. Because they can see all these different people made different choices. And I wondered when I read that quote, when they talk about spreading positivity, whether that's what the positive birth movement is doing. Are we spreading positivity, or are we actually spreading information, knowledge, wisdom? And we kind of maybe trying to heal that broken chain a bit. I'll skip on from that because I just want to talk about birth plans before I come to an end. So birth plans are really controversial, and I think that's very interesting. That's okay. But women are discouraged from making birth plans left, right and centre, as you'll see from some of the slides that I'm going to come on to. And in fact, I've opened a can of worms myself on social media just from being on this conference tour and talking about birth plans. I've now got people on Twitter telling me, actually birth plans are pointless. So this is the message that people get. Making a birth plan is pointless. You can't control birth, so don't make a plan. And for God's sake, if you do make a plan, don't call it a plan. Call it preferences or wishes or something like that. And I'm a little bit out on a limb with this one, because I actually do think we should call it a plan. And I know not everyone here will agree with me, and I'm absolutely fine that you don't agree with me. But I'll tell you why I think we should call it a plan. Because women are adults. And women know, like all adults, that you make plans in life and they usually come to shit. That's life, isn't it? How many plans have you made in your 30 or 40 or 20 years that you've had on this planet that haven't worked out exactly how you wanted? How did you feel afterwards? Disappointed, angry, gutted? Those are normal human feelings. You cannot protect a woman from having those feelings after birth by telling her not to make a plan or not to call it a plan. That is what happens when things don't go the way we wanted. We have feelings about that. We're not going to change that by taking away birth plans or by renaming them. So I think plan is a fine word. We make career plans, we make wedding plans, we make party plans, we make contingency plans. So when we're talking to women about birth plans, I think it's really important that we encourage them to make a plan A and don't be apologetic about it. It's okay to have a vision and a dream for how you want things to go. It might even help you to get that. It might not. You might not get that birth. So once you've got that vision, you also need to make contingency plans and think about other scenarios. Obviously, you can't think about every eventuality, but you can think about some of the main ways that birth might pan out and what you want to happen in those situations, even if you end up having a cesarean that you didn't want, or even if you end up having a cesarean under general anaesthetic. There are still things that you can do in every single birth, just like Zoe's example of taking the towel with you. There are things you can do to take back control and to feel more empowered in the experience, even if you don't get what you want. And this woman, Balshi Hazard, says that they're the closest expression of informed consent that a woman can offer her caregiver prior to commencing labour. So they're an opportunity for women to learn about all their choices, to put them down on paper, to think carefully about what they want, to find out evidence about things, and also they are a possibility of expressing some kind of consent to their care providers. But people don't like them, and I think this is really interesting, how culturally women are being discouraged and told constantly not to make them. These now, I'm told today, have been taken down, but I put these slides in after I did the first talk in Bath. I then discovered that this was going on Emma's Diary Instagram. And so I put the slides in to talk about it for the next conference, which was in London last week. And now, today, this morning, I find that apparently Emma's Diary have taken them down because so many people commented saying, this is really disempowering to women. Why are you giving women this message? It wasn't just me that was saying this. There were hundreds of other people saying, stop telling women not to make a plan because it's actually really undermining their efforts to learn and to be in control of their choices. But again, you know, this is a best-selling book, which some of you have probably read. I wish I'd sold as many copies as Adam Kay. This is Going to Hurt, it's called. And I absolutely cannot believe the way he writes. I can't believe two things about this book. First of all, I can't believe the ingrained misogyny in it. But second of all, I can't believe that nobody, apart from the odd person, is calling it out. Because we're that accepting of that attitude that we just go, such a funny book, and nobody notices it. It's hiding in plain sight. So here's this page about birth plans. With this woman who needs an emergency cesarean. He mocks everything about her choices. He says she's listening to whale songs, you know, and that she's probably specified the age and breed of the whale. He talks about aromatherapy, oils, hypnotherapy, and a request for the midwife to say surges rather than contractions. So we find even in those sentences, you know, just how much underneath the surface mockery is going on in people's heads to these actually really helpful things that are really helpful to women. And he says the whole thing was doomed from the start. Having a birth plan always strikes me as akin to having a what I want the weather to be plan or a winning the lottery plan. 2 centuries of obstetricians have found no way of predicting the course of a labour, which I don't think is actually true, but anyway. But a certain denomination of floaty dressed mother seems to think she can manage easily. So it's literally openly misogynistic, I think. And like I say, nobody is really that bothered by it, apart from maybe me and a few other folk.
There's a TV programme about it.
Yeah, it's now being serialised. It's being made into a TV programme. So, ka-ching for Adam Kay. So, misogyny pays. Ooh. And these were some tweets that I caught out about a year and a half ago on Twitter, where some obstetricians forgot that social media is actually, anyone can read it. Have you ever had that experience yourself? We all do it sometimes, don't we? But these people actually express these views on social media without thinking that there would be any kind of like problem with that. Obviously the tweets have now been deleted, but I've still got them. But actually, you know, the thing that kind of like arrested my attention when I saw these tweets was sort of almost like a gotcha feeling. Because I've heard doulas and midwives and women tell me a million times about snide remarks, funny attitudes, mockery, or just open, you know, criticism of birth plans. But I've never had any sort of concrete evidence. But this is about as concrete as you can get, isn't it? And I just wanted to raise as well that I think sometimes women get discouraged in their birth plan attempts with this phrase again, don't forget a healthy baby is all that matters. We need to really watch that message, because sometimes it will be a woman who is, you know, she's maybe read a book, or she's been to a really good hypnobirthing class, or you know, she's found something on social media, and she's starting to enthuse to the people around her in her life. I'm really excited about this. I'm going to have this kind of birth, and I'm really, really, really interested in this article I've just read about vitamin K, and do you know about optimal clamping and blah, blah, blah. And somebody will say, well, okay, but don't forget that the main thing about this is the healthy baby. That's all that really matters. So it kind of says again, calm down a bit, you know, stop trying to control everything and know everything, and just go with the flow. And I think Elizabeth Newham, who Sheena and I were talking about yesterday, says, go with the flow, but as long as it's the physiological flow, not the institutional flow. So, and that's a very distinct difference, which doesn't get much of a mention. And then there's this other, this is just my lined up slides about negativity about birth plans, but this person talked about middle-class birthzillas who are harassing hospital staffs with their birth plans. She said, we know, she said this at a conference in Ireland of obstetricians and birth workers. We know the woman who, because we've all had them, we think they're the only woman who's ever given birth, and they certainly think they're the only woman giving birth in the labour ward that day. So these are women with a real sense of entitlement, a real clear sense of how they should be treated and what they want. Appalling, isn't it? And then she goes on to talk about how these middle-class birthzillas are harassing well-meaning hospital staff with unrealistic birth plans, all the while egged on by ill-informed, overpaid midwives and doulas. That's you lot. But the thing is awful, but the thing I think that needs to be raised about this attitude as well is that having a voice and having a sense of entitlement is a privilege. Isn't it interesting that the people she's singling out in here, she mentions they're being middle class, and I think Adam Kay is talking about that kind of woman as well, the floaty dressed mother. Those are the women who are lucky enough to have had a good education, parents who cared about them and who nurtured them and who talked to them about things, internet access, money to pay for antenatal classes, ability to Google things and research things online, people to talk to who've, you know, can point them in the right direction, counselling, psychotherapy, all kinds of these wonderful privileges that have got them to that point where they can go into their labour and birth informed and knowing what they want. Those are the people that Dr. Mullally has the problem with. But they're just coming to her attention because they have a voice. They're annoying her because of their privilege, because they've got all that backup. But there are so many other women who haven't got access to all of those things. And Dr. Mullally doesn't give a monkeys about them because they're not bothering her. They're not harassing her with their sense of entitlement and their knowledge. They're keeping quiet and they're accepting what she says without question. So I think we need to think about privilege in maternity care as well, and how do we help that power and knowledge get out more widely into the mainstream to the people who haven't got access to it, you know, because of their circumstances, can't access it as easily as the middle-class birthzillas, of which I am one. So, just to sum up really, I think there is a power in just in the sharing of information and in women talking to women. I'm really proud of the positive birth movement for that. I do think it's incredibly dangerous, as was pointed out to me, because it's in some kind of subtle way, it does rock the boat. Bringing women together to share information and to say this can be different is actually quite a dangerous but fantastic message. So thanks for listening to me today. I'm very contactable. I've put some of my doodahs up there if you want to obviously come and see me. I'm here all day. But also, if you ever want to get in touch with me on social media or email me or start a positive birth movement group or anything else, just get in touch. So thanks ever so much for listening to me. Thank you. Come and get a bookmark.